Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hear me?
Can you see me?
I see your name.
Oh, how do I turn my thing on here? How's that? Start video. There I
There
am.
we go. Good.
How am I doing?
How are you?
I just took a shower and my face is all like shiny. I'm good. How
I
are you
just
doing?
I
Guess
just
what I just had?
shaved.
I shaved
What?
too. Guess what I just had?
A donut?
COVID.
Coffee?
COVID. I
Oh
spent the
yeah?
last week like I spent a few days with a fever and I oh, you've got some groovy background. I can
It's a,
see between your headset. I can see books between your headset and then but you've got like the inside of like some distressed concrete as your background there.
it's a painting in
Oh, there's that's
of
is
my
that your bedroom?
wife's. That's my room.
Okay.
Full disclosure.
Okay. So this is I'm at my sister's house right now.
Uh-huh.
I'm kind of living this gypsy homeless lifestyle right now. So, but here's my fancy pants microphone. Let me just check. There's got to be some sort of uh microphone, like how to find its settings.
It sounds good to me. You just got COVID?
I got it last week from like some people were over. I was staying at my sister's house and some people came over and I ended up with COVID and my sister's daughter got COVID too. So she's not showing any signs of anything, but it was just like I had a fever for 2 days and then I felt weak for about 4 days and I feel better, much better now. But
Okay, this is day 5 or
no, this has been over a week now.
over a week.
So
Okay.
it's been well over a week now since it started, almost 2 weeks since it started. Yeah.
And my brother got it. He's in North Carolina too, and he's pretty much of a hermit, so he's not sure how he got it.
I know exactly how I got it. Yeah, there was one person at this event that showed up
Yeah.
that had. So let me just do something. I'm going to tap the microphone. Just you tell me if you hear this, like if I'm obviously tapping the microphone.
Yes, I can hear it.
Okay, good. Then it means it's not I'll put the Russian hat back on.
Do I need more light on my puss?
No, you look good. I think I'm long since left the video thing. I'm just wondering if my head's too shiny.
I could just use audio if we want.
What do you think? I mean, are you putting this online eventually?
Yeah, I was sort of like, I'd prefer just to have a conversation as you as my friend
Okay.
and post it as is, as long as you are cool with it.
I'm cool with anything at this point. I've said more stuff online about all this than I can possibly ever backtrack away from. Like I'm
Right.
completely out in the social sphere at this point.
Yeah,
with
the
all this nuttiness.
cyberspace, I guess
Yeah.
they call it.
Is this
Yeah,
bothering here? Let me move this thing.
No,
This is
it's
kind of
fine.
annoying. I'll set this down like that. There we go.
But yeah, I'm just sort of let me get some coffee.
I've been drinking very, very little coffee lately and it feels great.
Good.
So I'm so tied up with I've got the things in my ears, the buds.
Yeah, my so I'm not sure how to start. I almost want to say, like, how was your 2020?
Oh, how was my 2020? It was pretty challenging. So there's some stuff that I'm going to choose not to say, but it was like I was in a long-term relationship and I broke up in 2020 and I left this beautiful place where I was living with this woman and the breakup was very amicable and we were all on good terms and such. So but I've been sort of homeless since then, since last summer. I've been staying in with friends and I'm at my sister's house right now. Eventually we'll be traveling to Seattle. I found which is a spot I've always wanted to live. And I've spent a lot of time in Seattle and it's outside of Seattle on one of the islands in Puget Sound. So a friend of mine has a great big house and they have an extra bedroom. So.
Yeah. It's almost like I'm curious about your experiences, but I want to honor it as something meaningful to you. and important to you. And I have a tendency to want to sort of psychoanalyze and sort of like say, how did you get to this place? And but I also sort of want to honor that it's personal and meaningful to you. And but I can't help thinking that I remember when we met we met at the Colonial restaurant on Broadway, and like Bowery with Anne and I think this was the beginning of your journey, and you were wondering how to document it. And I thought you were going to make a film, and I thought perhaps you should do it like Ross McElway. Sort of, I wanted you to sort of take us through, because I knew you as a friend, and that was my best gateway into understanding your journey and your experiences. And the guy who made Sherman's March is very much a documentarian. It's very personal. And I don't think you didn't end up making a film, but I think you started with your podcast, Hidden Experiences.
I did actually work on there was a film production that I was part of for a short while. It never really went anywhere. I realized I wasn't very charismatic on camera. Like I didn't hold up very well compared to some folks. And I was also very, very, very nervous because it was so early on. Like I was really ungrounded as far as trying to make sense of it. And that would have been in about 2007.
Yeah. And I remember also, because what was the most striking to me was your description of that missing time when you were a kid. That seemed to be very clear that you had missed time. You were with your friend and you wanted to be home for a TV show that you'd always watched. And you were clearly, I think, 2 hours late. And when you told me about this story, I was like, your film has to eventually go back to that person you were with and ask him what his experience was. And at that point, when we were at that restaurant, you were scared of talking to that person. Because one, if this was true, this is really weird. And if it's not true, I'm in trouble. Sort of like if he confirms this, quote unquote UFO experience, then that's weird. But if it didn't happen, then I'm in trouble there. Was that ever cleared up as far as?
I did contact him only a couple of years ago. So it took me forever to get up the nerve to contact him. And And so what I've learned in this realm is that there's these weird consistencies that show up. So we would have been 12 at the time, and we must have been like 2 summers ago. I asked him, so that we would have been about 57 or something at that point. He's the same age as me, or 56, I guess. And he didn't remember it. He did not remember the event, but he did remember that my parents were angry at me. So he remembered me talking at school about my parents were angry at me for coming home late. Okay. So he didn't remember the event on the sidewalk. So what happened was it would have been
as much as you remember, I think that you remember a flash of light.
That's all I remember is an orange flash. Yeah.
And then as life went on, you filled in the blanks, or what happened to that?
So the initial memory was, which I've always had, was walking home from a high school football game. And it would have been 1974.
And you were with your friend.
With my friend, whose name is also Mike.
Right.
And I was on my way home, and I wanted to see Kolchak the Night Stalker, which started at 10 o'clock, which I loved. I
love that show too. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Dan Curtis, big influence. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we got to a certain point in the sidewalk, and I could go, if I was to go back to that spot, and I've since taken pictures of it through Google Maps and stuff like that.
Yeah,
put a little X on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
So that is, and there was this, so it was nighttime, and it was a calm night. It was the Midwest, and it was warm. There was nothing unusual about the night, and calm. And so it wasn't like there was a lightning storm or anything. And it felt like just like click, everything turned orange, click, everything went back to normal. Like the entire sky lit up orange.
And that was the timing?
Click,
the way
click.
Right, okay.
Yeah, it lasted that long. Click on, click off. That's my memory. And then when I got home, so he lived a little further in the neighborhood. So he just said goodbye to me at my door and he kept on walking. And I went into the house. My parents were like super angry with me. They were both like, why are you out so late? I'm like, I'm not out late. It's 9:30. I told you I'd be home at 9:30. And we were looking at the clock and it was getting close to 11:30 and the 11 o'clock news was just ending. So the 11 o'clock news at that era would have been a half hour long and it was just ending. And it was and I didn't make any sense to me at all. And I was totally bummed out that I didn't
And it
see
was 2
show.
hours that you would have missed. So it's
Approximately
not,
2 hours. It's
yeah,
hard to know exactly.
right.
I did go through hypnosis at one point. Nothing came up, except I remember seeing the clock in our kitchen, which was interesting because, like, I had this super clear vision of this clock. I haven't seen the clock in 40 years, and the clock said 11:20. So I don't know what that means. So it was getting close to, it was very close to between an hour and a half to 2 hours long of missing time.
Okay. So for me, that was very striking as to, that was credible. As I mean, there's two parts of me. There's the sort of skeptic and the try to figure it out and psychoanalyze it. Then it's this is Mike's experience. I want to honor that as like, because he's a sincere, honest, serious guy, and I'm open-minded, and like, it's fascinating. And what it's become with your book and all the people you've interviewed and met in this whole like community, I think is wonderful, because on a basic human level, people are connecting and talking about things that they might not feel comfortable talking with other people. It's like sort of a version of coming out. So it's like, you have this deep, meaningful experience. It can be very isolating, and to feel and to connect with someone who's had a similar experience, even if not in details, and this was something that was meaningful to me. I think that on a basic level of people connecting is good, and there's nothing where's the harm, and in a certain way, it's I mean, I'm gonna jump around because I have,
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
because I'm like, I've at first I thought, have you seen that, I'm like, is this the right hemisphere talking to the left hemisphere? Is this a spiritual awakening? you know it was
It's all good questions. Yeah.
We sort of, I mean, I have to use sort of because I grew up in a chaotic, emotional, alcoholic family. I made films. I sort of peaked as a kid. You made Ace Gun Club, which I was very impressed with. And I made Hitchhike. They're sort of similar in that we have this spatial understanding and shots and angles and so forth. I think we had that same construct. We both came to New York. I'm from Maine, you from, I guess, the Midwest or so.
Michigan.
And I'm coming to NYU, and me not having a good experience, and you, I think, leaving. And I sort of went into, I've struggled with major depression most of
As
my
have
life.
I. Yeah.
Yeah. And my impression of you is that you came and you sort of were ahead in a certain way, in that you're an amazing illustrator, really smart, really serious, and I think you were already being started to be employed in New York at an ad agency, and you had sort of a failed romance, and then you exited the New York scene, and sort of, this is like, we don't, and then you sort of were in isolation, and you read these books, and then you had these experiences, and you had these memories, and uh, and like, I think it's a spiritual awakening. I mean, there's so many ways to interpret it, because I've had similar things. I came to New York because I was sort of, I was capable as an artist in my hometown and state. I came to New York to sort of like conquer. It didn't happen, and I had to find a deeper meaning as sort of life failures, and I found a spiritual experience through like doing 12 steps and so forth. And and when I think I accessed, my right hemisphere a little more, and that's when I started to have synchronicities, not to the degree that yours were, but I think you were also in isolation. So I think things became hyper meaningful in that isolation.
Well,
I
I moved out west and lived in a small cabin and took advantage of that. So the West for me was I lived near Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I lived in Jackson Hole for a while, and I lived in the next town over. And so that New York City has a crazy intensity to it. It's very artistic, and everyone's working on their novel or their so it's got this powerful intensity to it. But the West, that part of the West had that same intensity, except everyone
huh,
was doing stuff outside. Everyone was like, oh, I'm gonna ski more this year than I skied last year. I'm gonna do this incredible hike. I'm gonna go up to Canada and do some amazing trip or something like that. So it was weirdly similar in some ways.
hmm,
The characters you meet were intense the way the characters in New York are
right.
intense. So it wasn't so much I was in isolation, but it did allow me, what it allowed me to do? It allowed me not to have the New York City rent looming above me. So I could really, I had a tiny little cabin and I'd live cheap. And so I really had the advantage to really just explore everything. And that was before the internet. So it was all through books and things like that, and telephone calls at a certain point too.
Yeah, I think, and I got to a point where, I mean, speaking of intensity, where when I got married, I felt that I had to sort of grow up, and I started to late in life enter the corporate world rather than just sort of easy jobs. And it was very intense, and I sort of rose quickly within 6 years, but then I sort of burned out, and you know, I was the human doing rather than the human being, and there was a
Mhm.
calling. And for me, I have alcoholism in my family, and they call it a physical, mental, and spiritual disease. And so I didn't never did the steps, which is sort of, and I'd always considered myself an atheist, and I'd always been angry at you know God or whatever. So I had to sort out how to get to sort of find a new footing, and work on my inner life, with meditation and getting a higher power and all this stuff. I mean, I didn't, and all these things that sort of my wife thinks is hocus pocus, but for me, it's like it's what I had to deal with it, because earlier in life it was films and music that were sort of my higher power, sort of my guiding light, or like a girl I was in love with or something like that. Those are the things that sort of carried me. And as those fade, I have to replace it with something else. I don't know if this makes any sense, but I s- I see it. Um, I'm trying to sort of like find a parallel, and if there is one,
Well, the UFO mystery,
yeah,
if two people, so here's the way I've always said it: if two thoughtful people sit down to talk about UFOs, if they're truly thoughtful and open, it won't take but 3 minutes before they start asking the big questions. Is there a God? Why are we here? What does it mean? What happens after death? So and if you don't, and you start only talk about, like, measuring burn marks in the ground, or a witness testimony and the documentation that took place and the little checklist and how the person answered the questions, and whether you called the airport to see if there was some sort of radar signal that could corroborate someone's experience. If you only stay in that realm,
right,
you're purposely staying above the waterline. And to me, the UFO mystery forces you to, like, take that deep dive, because everything about it challenges your conceptions of reality. And and so at the core of this is a struggle with the definition of reality itself. So it forces you to really ask some big questions.
yeah. And I think that's where I find it interesting and where people, I don't know, where I feel I can connect and what's meaningful to me. Because I mean, it's almost like the measuring the burn marks is the science, and then the deeper question is the spirituality, whatever that is. For me, I'd always like wondered what spirituality meant. Within the New Age, it's all beautiful and wonderful, but if you read sort of Kierkegaard, it's a little, it's about you know dealing with the void and what you put in that place when I'm up against the void and these deep questions that are almost unanswerable, and I have to sort of, and for me the deepest spiritual experience, it's either fear or love. I'm either gonna bring fear to the idea of the void, or am I gonna bring love within it? And the more so I'm still grasping, but it's but the thing is that I don't want it to become this dogma or whatever. I
Oh,
want
and
it
it
to
it,
stay
it can,
open.
yeah, and there's a problem is I think it's human nature to want to give answers. That people want, like I worked on when I my first book on UFOs, the publisher was reading the book, and he's a smart guy, and his name is Richard Dolan, and he was I sent him the manuscript, and he's a good editor, and he was cleaning up a couple simple grammatical things, and he would call me up and say, "What do you mean by this sentence?" and stuff like that. Oh, that is an awkward sentence, and we talk on the phone and clean it up a little bit. And then he said, "I'm really enjoying this book, but when do you come to the conclusion? When do you like sum it up and tell me what it's all about?" And I'm like, we're not going to you're going to be really disappointed with the book because there is no summation. There is no conclusion. The conclusion is that there is a genuine mystery at play. So I felt a little like I needed to answer that in my second book. And, and I, and it was basically like you have to keep the question open, because as soon as you turn it into dogma or a religion, then you're so focused on one thing that everything else is eliminated.
Yeah,
So and then if you leave everything open, I mean, then the soup is just turns to mush sometimes, because there's too
right.
many ingredients in it. So it's been a funny balancing act to try to remain objective, even though I'm totally subjective. It's a very personal subject for me. So I recognize that I'm subjective, but to recognize also that it's a fantastic, evolving, open-ended mystery that that when I realized I wasn't going to solve it, my life got a lot easier.
Yeah, interesting. But I think what's good is that it is the community that you found, I think, because there's also a theory of addiction, meaning that when they had those rat experiments where they choose the water or the heroin, the rats were isolated. And then when they put it into a community where there were other activities for the rats to do, they didn't always choose the heroin, they choose the activity. So there's a certain new theory of addiction that a lot of it has to do with staying connected to others. And I think within COVID, I think people are understanding the importance of humans being together. There's this
Mm-hmm.
unspoken connection that is, I think, most striking when it's removed rather than, and then it's sort of. So I think I think that's important, that within the mystery we can do it together, peacefully, and with sort of be kind and loving, which is I've always found, as I when I was a kid, I liked the toughness. I came to New York because it was a tough city. As I grow older, my wife says, my favorite quality of you is your sweetness, and I'm like, oh well, but as I'm growing older, I'm realizing the power of sweetness and kindness and so forth. It's and Yeah.
Well, if you go to a UFO convention,
Right.
event, and you've had these experiences, it's remarkably liberating because you have permission to talk about this stuff. So you have
Yeah.
permission to sit down with someone you just met and ask them, like, what's going on in your life? What happened?
Yeah.
How are you dealing with it? How are the challenges been? Where are you at now?
Right.
And that having that community, at a UFO conference, there's you're in a sea of people, and then at home you have access to telephone numbers and emails and stuff like that, so you can contact these people. But that the people that have had these experiences are very often big-hearted souls, and there's a um, and as I said before, like I'm not objective, I'm subjective in the sense that I'm seeking out the people that reflect back at me the questions that I'm struggling with. So,
Hmm.
but I'm finding that there's a there's a thoughtfulness in these folks, and then there's a few things that people ask in the checklist. Like one of them is, are you a creative type? And it's very high. It's a very high yes within
Mm.
these contact experiences, that people will be creative painters, illustrators, poets, that kind of thing. And then also, which is a very weird detail, which doesn't quite qualify for me. Some people would argue otherwise, but healers, people who are doing healing work. Sometimes it's actually just a straight nurse, someone who works in a hospital as a nurse, and other times it's um, Reiki healing. The number of people, like when I do telephone interviews, which I do a lot of, less so now lately, but I did them for a long time. And I kept some notes. I put the date and the time and the telephone number of the person I was talking with. And I made some minimal notes. Usually it was a single sheet of paper. And when I would in the corner write Reiki, and I would just wait for him to say, like,
Mm.
oh, I'm a Reiki healer. I'm a Reiki master.
Yeah.
So that's a very odd detail. Like, it's not 100% of the people with these contact experiences that are Reiki masters, or doing some sort of, and Reiki by definition is a energy healing, basically healing with either hands or energy. And that has fascinated me, that the
Can I,
people who I'm in contact with are having this mystical, I have these mystical skills of healing.
do they practice Reiki after the experience or before? Is there a correlation of,
I wish I could answer that when I haven't done enough
yeah,
research on it, but it's
yeah.
so if the assumption is anyone who's had these experiences has had them since birth,
Hmm.
had them all their life. That's not a hard and fast rule, but some people would generalize and say that. So given that as a model, you would have to think that the Reiki came afterwards, or that they were predisposed. Uh, like some people just say, "Oh, I've never taken a Reiki class, but I can do hands-on healing, and
Yeah.
I've done it all my life." But that they're, in a sense, they're describing Reiki. Um, and this one fellow uh, who's had these experiences basically said, do you have any healing skills? And without me prompting, he said, oh, well, my wife was going through cancer treatment, and I could just simply put my hands above her body and generate a kind of heat that would minimize the effects of the chemotherapy,
Yeah.
which I thought was fascinating.
So I did early mention the right and left hemisphere. There's Ian McGilchrist who wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary. I think he's a neurobiologist who studied at Oxford, and I learned about him through a book by Gary Lockman, The Secret. Um, so, and this idea of the right hemisphere being older and sort of speaking in symbols and so forth, and I think of the left hemisphere as the intensity, and then the right hemisphere is a little more open. I feel like I sort of when the left hemisphere became so intense that the right hemisphere took over. When I let go, when I surrendered to, when the pain became so much of the depression, I sort of had to surrender and choose a higher power, and I had to choose sort of peace and love and um, uh, then I started to have synchronicities, and then I mean, there's also the theory of the inner child, of like the inner child is sort of true self, and in an abusive upbringing that child goes, hides, and then when it's safe to come out, comes out. And so I can come at it at all these different angles, and I I am very reluctant to latch onto any one, because I don't have um I'm not interested in selling one idea, and maybe I'll make a film about it or something. But and what is a soul? What is a spirit? I mean, is there an inner child and is it a true self? But I feel like there's something. When I was at that corporate situation, I was making more money. It was by the name of it, it was impressive. But I realized my friends didn't really care. They cared about whether I was a kind and good
Mhm.
person. And I realized I was trying to sort of win my wife, even though she'd already, married me, but I was struggling against my own self, my depression, where at the deep, at the bottom, I feel worthless and I feel like life is worthless. And then I tried to, um, prove that I wasn't worthless. And then at a certain point, I realized it's not working, and that I had to deal with the depression, which is, I think, my conversation with God or reality or life on life's terms as it is, and my expectations of life and how I treat myself, and these things that I'd fixed about myself that I need to open up and re-examine. Like, are these things, are these things true? Do I hate myself, or am I just disappointed because the things didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, and so forth? And I mean, I think um, um, I don't know. I mean, so that's
Well, so here, let's go. So I had my first memory of what I would call clinical depression happened when I
right.
was in junior high school. I remember being a junior high school kid, and I remember being feeling so isolated in a way that I would, during lunch hour, I wouldn't go to the cafeteria. I would just walk around the school, and I would just walk really fast so no one would interrupt me. And I just walk and walk and walk these loops around the school, just and I that was, in looking back at it now, that was clinical depression. It was my inability to, like, I wanted to isolate. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I was stuck in this internal stew in a way where I couldn't I couldn't deal with anyone. Now that happened at the same. So here's the problem now. That event with the orange flash in the sky happened in seventh grade. So that would have been junior high school. My first memories of clinical depression happened in junior high school. I have struggled a lot wondering whether that event could have been the trigger for clinical depression.
Mm.
And I don't have a good answer to that. Like, it would, you could say one thing caused the other thing, and I had a reaction. So the missing time might have been so traumatic that it manifested as clinical depression. Um, I've seen a lot of abduction researchers. Many of them are therapists, like practicing therapists, clinicians, whether psychiatrists or psychologists or family practitioners and counselors. Like, and I'll say, I've had a history of clinical depression, and they'll nod like they've heard that many, many times.
Mm.
So the people who have had these experiences are often they're often so I actually interviewed a he was a Jungian psychologist. His name is Gibbs Williams. He's no longer practicing Jungian. He's doing a different form of analysis, but there was a fellow named Bud Hopkins who did a lot of hypnosis and was sort of the face of the UFO abduction research. And he died in 2011. And I worked with Bud for a few years. He was in New York City, and he so Gibbs Williams like did the diagnostic tests. He did a battery of what would be standard tests for on the people who claimed UFO contact or UFO abduction. And his conclusion was that these people were not mentally ill. They did show signs of stress or buried trauma, which have very clear markers in a personality test and things like that. So the people who have had these experiences would diagnostically come out as having underlying stress or buried trauma. And then Bud Hopkins talks about working with another psychologist, and they went through a whole litany of tests, and Bud Hopkins did not tell the psychiatrist what the malady that the people were, what this group had in common. And once again, they said there was buried trauma or buried stresses, tensions, and things like that. And then when Bud said, well, here are the people that in this group all claim to have had contact experiences, UFO abduction experiences, some of which are unremembered. And the person said, well, I can't speak to the validity or reality of that as something that could actually happen, but I can say, if that did happen, these are exactly the kind of markers we should expect in an individual. So that was kind of a long answer for a kind of a wishy-washy way to.
No, there's interesting. I mean, because I can clearly point to my mother's alcoholism and her erratic and terrifying behavior as I was a kid. Being in that family was just very frightening, and it was all her emotional ups and downs. I mean, we had enough money, we had a roof over our head, we could pay the mortgage, and there was no physical, it was all emotional. And I completely bought into her reality of to her, when she was either drunk or or upset, to my child, it was like the world is ending and it's my fault, and or she would be in a state of self-pity and so forth. So I was caught up in this reality that felt totally real, but I realized today was completely based on her fear, and then it came out as anger or and her own spiritual unrest. And I bought into it, and I bought into her reality, and I sort of like coming out of that experiencing and realizing, and trying to figure out what's so I can point to the trauma and say, well, that had to do with my depression later in life. And also I had a friend of mine in high school, commit suicide, and very violently. And he took himself out. I mean, he tried to take over-the-counter sleeping pills, and that didn't work. And so he walked out with a can of gasoline out into this field and set himself on fire. And I was like, and it was a summer where my parents were divorced, and I was alone in a small house on the beach that my father had rented. And I was alone, and my friend had done this horrific suicide, and I couldn't feel anything. And I was like, I felt like I was a monster. I couldn't connect. That wasn't real to me. And I had a bit of a break with reality. There was a certain like dissociative experience, or I felt there was this break, and it was frightening. And I feel like, what's the word, like you feel unhinged or something. And I had to sort of turn the TV on to sort of get into the normal consensus reality trance, rather than being in this frightening place where I didn't know what was what. And it was only because I was like, my friend is dead, is this violent, and I'm like, I'm not crying, I don't feel anything. Like, am I inhuman? I had all these doubts about myself. And then when I finally went to the funeral, I was able to cry, and I watched myself cry. And the priest ironically said, crying is for home, and you should not cry at the funeral. It
Oh
was
God, that's
like, I
awful.
was like, but I felt like, oh my God, I'm human, it is real, I'm engaged, I'm reacting logically to my friend's death. So, I mean, and I'd had a lot of buried grief and like, or delayed grief, or had grief that was, that came out only when I felt safe or whatever,
Mhm.
or when it came out. Some people can sort of only cry at movies and so forth. Anyway, so, but it's a mystery. I also, did you ever see the movie Safe with um, the Todd Haynes film with Julianne Moore? It's a fascinating film about a woman who, she's either a sort of trauma survivor who's lived sort of a fake life of what she's supposed to do. She married the man she's supposed to marry. She did all the things that her parents wanted her to do. And so she's living in the 80s, this sort of like life, but then she's having environmental illness at the same time. And she wonders about fumes, and she's thinking maybe her sickness is from these fumes, or then she goes to a doctor to get allergy tests. And all throughout the movie, it's right on that edge of like, is she having an existential crisis? Is this a post-traumatic stress? Is this sort of the inner child, emerging, or is environmental illness real? And when she finds a community, and it's brilliant in that it could be either one. Like when she is getting the tests for allergies, the doctor like puts in one of the tests and then gets a phone call and walks away, and she has a panic attack, and the doctor comes back and says, oh, you're allergic to this, the last thing I shot. But the sort of abandonment of the doctor,
Mhm.
there could be a cycle, if she's that like sensitive and raw, that someone, the doctor leaving. And so it's an interesting movie to watch, I think. And because uh, because I'm trying to process this, but also as far as like, and I'm in. Um, did you ever see the movie Fearless too? It's a
Mhm.
Peter Weir film, and that's a
Yeah.
fascinating film in that he's a guy who's terrified, goes through this plane crash, and then suddenly like lets go, and it's almost like, I don't know if his right hemisphere takes over, and suddenly he's not, he doesn't have feel, he almost has a high, and he finds himself, the fear just sort of dissipates, and like it's just, you surrender to it, and then some other sort of part takes over. I kind of think it's the right hemisphere. I don't know. I'm not a scholar. I'm a
Yeah.
filmmaker, an artist. So, and he has this point where he saves these people on this plane, and then he goes and he kind of feels superhuman. He still has this high over overcoming this deep fear and sort of conquering death, but he wants to still, like, he gets on the edge of a building to maintain that feeling, and suddenly he has to go back to earth because he can't relate to anybody on earth, and he wants everything to be very pure. He doesn't want to lie to the insurance company in order to, but if he doesn't lie to the insurance company, the widow of his best friend, gets no money or something like that, and he realizes he has to go back to planet earth and be, I don't know, and I somehow think there may be a connection to what's going on. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. You haven't seen Safe, but you've seen
Yeah.
Fearless. Yeah. Any impressions? Or am I way off the mark?
No, it's interesting because if the UFO thing is to be addressed, everything's open. Like,
Yeah.
so honestly, like I'm just as content talking about like your future self influencing your past self, or your
Huh.
higher self influencing, I'm using sort of new agey terms, but
Yeah.
like uh or your higher self or your best self sort of influencing your day-to-day self to make these choices. Or so it feels like I made a very powerful choice to take on this research and to take on this the core of my research has been owls in a sense, so this archetypal animal. Now, like, and you just said it a moment ago that you're an artist and a filmmaker. Now, people have complained to me. They said, like, one guy, this is funny, it's a nice guy, got a hold of me because he was said, like, your research drives me crazy. You're not scientific. And I said, what do I care? I'm not a scientist. Who says I have to be scientific? Like, a journalist isn't following the rules of science when they write an article in the New York Times. They're following sort of journalistic rules. And so I'm approaching this as an artist. I'm trying to be honest, but I'm not beholden to science to make my, to write about this stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
That's why I think it's more of a spiritual journey and something more like about that we've lost myth and a new way of finding a new form of one's spiritual life, or a new meaning, or a new metaphor. But maybe I interrupted you.
no. Well, so Joseph Campbell was being interviewed by Bill Moyers in that documentary TV series, which I've watched like 20 times. And Joseph Campbell said, like, our old myths aren't working, right? So our old myth, it was one tribe was in one valley and they had their own mythology, and there was another tribe in another valley, and they would clash sometimes, and then they would trade sometimes, but they also both had their little identity myths, and they were separate, so we have all these disparate myths of the tribe. And he said, so those myths aren't working for us anymore in this new global world where our planet itself is potentially so fragile. And so Bill Moyer said, like, what is the new myth? And he said, I can't tell you the new myth any more than I can tell you what tomorrow's dream will be, but I can say that the new myth will have to be a global myth. And then when I heard that, I was like, that's the UFO myth.
Yeah.
The mythos. The UFO is a flying saucer, is a structured craft that comes from somewhere else, whether it comes from another galaxy or another dimension or wherever it comes from. No, like, you can argue that all day long, you'll never prove it. But so we as humans on Earth are confronted with this mythological archetype that comes from somewhere else. Right? It's not coming from the ocean. It's not coming from the mountaintops. It's not coming from the forest the way our old myths did. It's coming from somewhere else. So we, as a collective society, have been confronted with this new myth, and how are we going to deal with that myth?
And it's interesting that the fact that it's from somewhere else and not from the planet means that we might all be able to more people from disparate parts of the planet could come together with that, because it's not of this earth.
Yeah. So, that was Ronald Reagan made that funny plea at the United Nations where he said, like, our differences would dissolve very quickly if we were confronted by an alien threat from outside this galaxy. And
taken from the day the Earth stood still, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's the myth. I don't think that's actually how it's playing out, but that's the myth.
Yeah, and I think they're like, the postmodernists would argue that there's no more grand narratives, but we actually kind of need one in order to rally and to find some consensus to get along without in some sort of a structure of but when you were young, what did you want to be when you grew
I wanted to be a
up?
filmmaker. I wanted to be Martin Scorsese. Yeah.
I wanted to be Kubrick.
Oh, well, so there's the guy who made the best movie about UFO abduction that's ever been made.
Yeah.
Dave gets abducted from the spaceship and gets taken to the oddly lit white room. That's like straight out of every abduction thing. That's the question everyone, like the hypnotherapist says, describe where you are.
Yeah.
It's like, it's this weird room. It's like, it's lit from nowhere. And that's where Dave Bowman went, and
Like
he
the
went through
sort
the
of,
psychedelic wormhole,
yeah.
so he like entered a different reality, and it was this timeless reality where that's what, so people who have these experiences, they come back and they say, time didn't work the same. Time totally didn't work the same. That's the same thing that someone who has a near death experience says. They said, oh,
Hmm.
where I was, time just didn't work the same. Like it just felt like I was dead for 4 minutes on the operating table, and then I have like 2 weeks worth of memories. So there's this other realm in the near death experience. Is it like are you standing at the gateway to heaven? You know, are you in that kind of realm? The UFO contact experience is being on board a flying saucer. Is that is that a metaphor for this alternate reality? So people who so even someone who sees a flying saucer in their backyard, right? So flying saucer flies over their yard, they will almost universally describe the same thing. They will describe, it's about close-up UFO sighting. They'll describe a weird silence. And it's not that the craft itself is quiet. It's that everything is quiet. There's no crunching of leaves. There's no rustling of wind. There's no birds chirping. There's no crickets. There's no noise. There's exactly a total void of silence. And they will also describe an odd clarity, their mind is in this weird clarified realm. They'll say colors are different, colors are heightened, colors are different. So whatever's going on, it's a little bit more than just a spaceship with a really quiet engine.
Yeah, it's almost an altered state of consciousness. Are
So
they
exactly,
afraid, or are they sort of, or are they
that can run the whole gamut.
attached?
Yeah,
What?
that can run the whole gamut. Some people are terrified.
Yeah.
Some people are bored.
Huh.
It's very common for like, husband to call his wife out. Honey, come out and see this. She looks at it for a minute, flying saucer hovering above the backyard, and said, oh, great, I'm going to go back in.
Huh.
Totally, totally void of any emotion at all.
Yeah.
And some people are in awe. Oftentimes people will get communication, like telepathic communication, like this is important, or we're here for you, or um, we're doing this for you. We want you to see us. That's the kind of messages they'll get. And this is simply a UFO sighting. And that's not at the core of my research. My research is more the people who are interacting with the beings on board the craft.
It's interesting because Kubrick was avowed atheist, but the monolith, I guess, I don't know if it's the definitive theory, is that it was an alarm system. This higher intelligence saw our civilization and saw it as savage and potentially dangerous, and they said, if this civilization gets to the point where their technology is such that they can reach the moon, we want to hear about it. So we're going to sort of put this alarm system there on the moon, sort of walk away and do our business, and that alarm goes off, that we have to watch these people. But then at the same time, within the apes, I'm thinking it was almost the source of how they became, you know, how they use the bone for a tool. So it was
Yeah.
at the other end, um, they gave the gift of the tool, but then they also wanted to check us at the
And then,
end.
well, the movie culminates with a lot more than that. I mean, Dave goes through the wormhole and then returns to Earth as a trippy, glowing star baby.
Yeah, almost in a,
So
maybe in the womb of a.
of
It
a
also,
and
you know,
that's right in the literature too. That's all over the literature that
huh?
women claim to have these hybrid children.
Yeah. So that's the thing. It's I came to New York to sort of like become a professional, and I didn't um, find it satisfying being a professional. I still loved being an amateur and following my instinct. And at a certain point, I couldn't afford film, so I made weird music. And then when I could afford film, I decided, because there was this whole idea of if I can't make, grown up real movies, then I won't make them. And then at a certain point, I said, well, F it. I'm going to make them the way I made them as a kid. And, because I was criticized and why was my films being too esoteric and about, I mean, it's but it's almost like I had the nature of like a painter, but I wanted to use film, but and that I needed to follow what was meaningful to me, and I needed to follow what seemed to make, follow this thread. I mean, well, this is somehow meaningful to me. I want to find out where this leads me, rather than, what is the market looking for? How do I sell this product? And for me, that wasn't it wasn't an intimate experience about um, dancing with my unconscious, or like
Mhm.
speaking to my unconscious. And the other thing I think I wanted to mention was sort of like Jung's Red Book experience, that he'd seen himself as a scientist, but there was an artist's nature within him that needed to speak. And it was also the breakup of Freud, which was very traumatic. And so, and I think a lot of they didn't agree on the paranormal, and Jung's mother was a medium and so forth. So he was steeped in what you could call the occult or paranormal, but it was something he wanted to shut out. And even being an artist seemed to be something he didn't want to embrace. But that book is incredible, and it was something within him that needed to be expressed. It was like he couldn't, and shutting that down had, delirium, had damaging consequences, and he struggled with a gun under his pillow or whatever, and it was like, so he struggled with this thing that needed to speak from within himself. And that I find fascinating. And I don't know how it relates to I think the soul or something, or the soul of an artist and so forth, it needs to speak, um and it's not a commercial or scientific thing. It has something to do, I don't know, I find it fascinating, but it's something that, and it's mysterious, and that's why it's fascinating. It's
Mhm.
like there was no mystery in, like, well, I'll get a book how to sell my idea. I'll just do something that's already been popular. It seems too mechanical, and something that's dealing with the mysterious seems to be more exciting. Like there's a sense of discovery. Like when I was a kid, I think the first thing I wanted to be was an inventor of something, coming from, to invent something I thought was the most exciting thing. And once, you know, and the invention of being an artist seemed to be the most exciting thing. You have any impressions about my rant?
Well, I'm thinking of myself when you said at a certain point you said you were pulling on this thread and it felt like you needed to pull on this thread. And so I'm in 2006, I saw a bunch of owls with a friend in two separate camping events. I went out and so like three owls flew around us, landed near us, and it was mystical and bizarre and happened twice in within 4 days. Three owls flew around us. And in that moment of seeing those owls, like there was a so I'm camping, sun is setting, owls are flying around us, weird, like multiple owls. And I hear a voice in my head, like they're literally landing at our feet and staring at us. And I hear this voice in my head that very clearly said, this has something to do with the UFOs. So I knew that I had a few UFO type experiences. The missing time event that I saw, that I talked about, I had a close-up UFO sighting also when I was 12 years old, of a structured craft in the sky. And then when I was 30, I saw out my window in Maine, I saw five gray aliens like outside my window walking towards the house. And I and that was at a time of severe clinical depression. So I doubted that event.
Right.
Like I've tried to, so what was happening is, so now go to 2006, I have this experience with this owls. I have the voice in my head that says this has something to do with UFOs. So I started, like, I realized I got to look into this. So instead of looking into UFOs, I started looking into owls. It's like, it was easier than me kind of like trying to unpack my own baggage, what might be there, which was scary. I was denying and avoiding that, but I was asking these questions about owls. So I did go through the act of trying to explore my own experiences. But in doing so, I would ask everyone, have you had any odd experiences with owls? And oftentimes they would say yes. And then I would collect these stories, and the stories were so weird and so strange. And so in 2009, I started a blog, and very early on in the blog, I started to explore the owl stuff. And right on the blog, and it's right in the very top there, I say, I want to hear your owl stories. So if anyone in the whole world, you can do it right now. You can just Google UFOs, owls, and I'm the first thing that comes up. And I'm the next 20 things that come up underneath that. So anyone in the world has a weird experience with UFOs and owls, I am like 2 mouse clicks away, and they're going to find me, and they're going to send me their stories, which I've been grateful for. And I have been collecting, archiving, and trying to make sense of these stories. It's hard to know. People say, how many stories do you have? And I'm like, oh my God, I have no idea. Like they're like the stories that have arrived through email. I have many thousands.
Mhm.
And then, people that have things that have been told to me and such. So uh but so here I'm going to tell a story. This doesn't have anything to do with UFOs, but it has everything to do with this archetypal, mysterious power that these stories have. So a guy contacted me, and he grew up in Michigan, and I think he was a member of a Native American tribe, and I didn't know there was uh, um, a reservation in this part of Michigan, and I looked it up, and there is. And so I think it was like the Huron tribe. And you look at the little, it's just this little postage stamp size thing on a map, and it's nothing. It looks like a regular neighborhood, but it's technically an Indian reservation. So he grew up on this Indian reservation in Michigan, very close to where I lived. And he was a 12-year-old boy and had a kite. And it was a kite, like it was a very fancy kite that you would compete with, right? So it had a special sort of string mechanism so you could steer the kite in flight. And and it was a windy day, and something had never happened to him before. The kite got caught in a really strong gust of wind, and he lost the ball of string, or the string mechanism, and the kite like soared into the sky and then flew into the trees, into a forest nearby. And he loved this kite, and so he went with a friend and said, let's see if we can go into the woods and find this kite. So they went into the woods, and sure enough, they found it at the top of a tree. They could see it. So they went to the tree and looking up in the tree, but then they looked down, and there was an owl, a live owl, all wrapped up in the string at the base of the tree. And so they got a friend, and they cut the owl loose, and they realized that the owl was injured, and they nurtured it back to health and let the owl go. And he told me this story. This is a weird part, and I kind of know why I asked it, but I asked a question. I said, "Are you a shaman?" And he said, "In a word, yes." So now that story to the pragmatic scientist means nothing, right? But to the artist, to the storyteller, that story is like imbued with this richness. Like a little boy loses his kite, and an owl gets trapped in the string, and the boy saves the owl. Like, wow, that's that. Like if I wrote that in a script, that would be like the mythological magic that would start a really powerful story. So this is what I'm finding in these stories, is that embedded in these stories, these owl stories, is this poetic, mythic power. And that's what I'm drawn to.
Yeah, and I think um, because I don't have these experiences, I mean, honestly, I feel like when I listen to like Whitley Strieber or one of these things on YouTube or something, I'll have moments where I'll be sitting and I'm like, oh, it's going to happen. I'm going to look out the window and I'm going to see what Mike saw. Even walking to Starbucks and coming back here, I was like, I'm going to see an owl. I'm going to see an owl because I've heard, and it doesn't happen. I've had moments of sort of paranoia and so forth, and being scared and like, oh, but nothing really supernatural
But you
has
said you went through a
happened.
period of synchronicities.
I did, but they um, and so I know, and it had to do with my uh, um, contending with my spiritual side. It had to do with the depression or the left brain or whatever, or my thinking my way out of it just was too painful. It was painful inside with my self-hatred, and that was my depression had got to a point where I was like, there was no help outside or inside, and I had to clean up. I had to start from scratch and go like, what am I doing here? What's going on? What are my assumptions? Why I have to embrace gratitude. I have to embrace acceptance. I have to forgive whatever I think God is. I have to forgive myself and my mother, and I have to heal because this isn't working anymore. And at a certain point, when I did do the steps within AA, there was less of a tight fist. I mean, the first, there was more relaxation. It's like I was 7 years dry from alcohol, and that's like having a machine that has no oil and the gears just will wear each other out. You need a substitute for the substance to deal with the fear and the self will. And if you can't get a substance and you can't get, an addiction one way, you have to use the spiritual, the steps, and have a relationship with a higher power and adopt certain spiritual principles in order to have an ease in my life and an ease with the unknown, which I basically, just had to bring a little more love into my consciousness,
Hmm.
rather than. I'm sort of always getting off track, but
And so I could do it too. Yeah, it's normal.
but
Yeah.
um, I do think, in a general sense, if I don't have these exact experiences or anything close to paranormal, I think that there's something about that, maybe, Joseph Campbell says this, that there's a need within us for a poetic, for a mystic. These are important, and that science gets to a certain point, but it needs to be balanced by, and I keep thinking of it as the left and right hemisphere of like, and I'm not, a scholar on any of that, but I'd have to say, and that something like that, there's an inner wisdom within us that's smarter than we are, that kind of like, it may seem crazy, but you know jump a few decades and it'll be the thing that saves us. It'll maybe seem crazy at the moment, but it might be the thing and the hope that turns things around when we get to that's just my hope. It's like, and I've always believed in the individual, and that I've always been drawn to like someone like a Jean Genet, who had a horrible upbringing. He was a writer in France whose mother was a prostitute and gave him up after like 10 months or whatever. And he was this artist who was a gay guy who was within, and he was, he's a thief, and he ended up in prison, and he was compelled to write this novel in prison. They would find the manuscript, throw it away. He'd keep writing it. And he finally wrote his way out of prison. I mean, Jean Cocteau and other artists saw this manuscript and said, this guy's a genius, and they got him out of jail. And he sort of, and he was sort of a queer pioneer. I mean, it was like, but in a certain sense, he's this misfit. But then, but he followed his. It's the same thing, I guess. It's like, the person who the fool persists in his folly, he will become wise. I think that's William Blake or something. I still believe in that. I believe in that there's a certain that sometimes you can follow this madness and you'll become wise, or that it'll become a greater truth, even if it's not scientifically accurate. It's something that the soul or spirit of the planet needs in order to that we do need these myths. And I guess probably Joseph Campbell could say it better, but I'm going from the personal to the profound in a certain way.
And I don't have to have the experience of having an owl get wrapped up in my kite string.
right.
Like I can hear that story and tap into the power. It doesn't need to happen to me. And I've had enough experiences at this point that I'm like, I don't feel like I need any more experiences. Like I'm sold. Like I'm sold on the, like no one has to. And so I had a, but I was struggling. And what was happening is there was like a tape loop in my head that was saying between about, and I've said this many times, between about 2006 and about 2010, 11, like I spent, well, it was actually this, it ended in 2013. There was a tape loop in my head that was just grinding away that said, is this possible? Can these things really happen? Did it really happen? Did these things really happen? Did this happen to me? Did these really happen to me? Did it really happen to me? And that tape loop just like destroyed me. Like I couldn't function. Like the stresses of that tape loop just spinning endlessly. Did this really happen? Could this happen? Did this happen? Did these things really happen? It generated that frenetic tension, energy generated frenetic, tense synchronicities. And I had an experience in 2013, on March 10th, 2013, where I was camped out along the side of a road in southern Utah. And I woke up, I was driving back from a UFO conference, and I was sleeping outside in a quiet, rural, pristine, desert, empty area. And I woke up 3 times that night. And the first time I woke up, I looked up at this hillside and there was this round building on a hilltop. Have you heard this story before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a round building on a hilltop, and I looked at it and I said, that looks just like a landed flying saucer. And that looks just like a landed flying saucer. And could it be? And I stared at it and stared at it and stared at it. And I just was like, no, it's not. It's just got to be a house or something. So I rolled over and went to sleep. And then I woke up again, and it's not an owl, but I woke up again and there were 2 coyotes howling nearby. One was very close. Like I've slept out, like I did a lot of outdoor stuff in all the years I lived out west and stuff. And I've heard a lot of coyotes, and I've slept out under the stars a lot. And I have never, ever heard something that loud and that close. Like it felt like the coyote was right next to my head. And I looked around, I couldn't see it. There was sagebrush around, and coyotes are small. And I was like, where is this thing? It was howling. It was so close. It was so loud. In retrospect, looking back at this now, I feel like that was some sort of projected theater. Like a coyote is every bit as imbued with mythic, poetic power as owls. So, in the mythos is of the trickster, So and then I woke up a 3rd time, and there was a bright light behind a bush, and I sat up. And I did this thing like, what is that light? It didn't look like a car light. Why would anyone be there? Maybe someone was camping just like I was camping. And I did something very odd. I just laid my head back down and went back to sleep. And now, since then, the events of that night, to tell the story properly, it takes so long. And there's all this psychic stuff and maps, and they connect to other things.
Right.
But what happened
You
was,
can find that on the internet if you're curious.
yeah, you can find it. It's on the internet. It's also in the last like 40 pages of my first book. And I, in essence, tell it again in my 3rd book, much, much, much more completely. So like this story, so I basically, within a day or so of that event, I had this epiphany. Like all of a sudden it was like, oh, like it really happened. It really happened. Like I've really had UFO contact. I did. And the reason I was the magical synchronicities that were associated with this. So it wasn't the night under the stars. It was this crazy set of synchronicities that connected to these 3 other lines in a map. And it takes a long time to tell, but
right.
And
but there were too many that connected and related to another to sort of dismiss them. I've had synchronicities, but they've been pretty singular. They haven't connected to one another. That was the astonishing thing of that story, is that it was more than one, and they seem to relate to one another. So yeah, if I'm correct.
Yeah. So that what happened was the tape loop turned off. And it was like this, like I can breathe. Like I can breathe. The tape loop is gone. Like this questioning, did it really happen, is gone.
Right.
And I found that I immediately was able to be, I mean, yes, I was confronted with a story that by all means shouldn't happen, right? Like the consensus reality says it's impossible,
But your soul
but
was sort of liberated,
but
like
totally
the
liberated. Yeah,
yeah,
completely
yeah. It
liberated.
was
So
like
I
I
was,
don't have to control this.
I don't
Yeah,
have to like, I don't have to live in this endless self-doubt. I no longer
right,
doubt. Like I don't have an answer to what it is, but I no longer
right.
doubt it. Now, if you really want to get to the weird stuff, I did a hypnosis session. Have you heard about this? The hypnosis
No,
session I did about, so
no.
I confronted I've done it with two separate hypnotherapists and the exact same story emerged. I'll, with one hypnotherapist, her name is Yvonne. So now I'm not like the story that emerged, like, I don't know if it's true. Like like I saw it in my mind's eye and
Uh-huh.
I have a recording of me speaking all these words on a
Right.
hypnotherapist's couch, but like, I am like so skeptical of whether this happened. I, in the session, she's like, okay, where are you? And I'm like, I'm sleeping under the stars. And what's happening? Well, there's a light behind a bush. And all of a sudden I start going, I know it's them. I know it's them. It's them. I know it's them. And then the next thing is like, whoop. I'm like, I'm out. I'm floating. I'm, I'm floating. I'm looking down at this big round structure on the hill. I'm floating above it. But I think my body's still in the sleeping bag. I think my body is still is in the sleeping bag. And then the hypnotherapist, are you out of body? And I'm like, I think I am. I think I'm. And then the next thing I'm like, whoosh, I'm inside this craft. And I'm like, do you remember the Andromeda strain, the underground thing
Vaguely.
in the Robert Wise movie there? Like
Uh-huh.
there's an underground secret government base and it has these curved hallways. And they walk around these curved hallways. And I was like, all of a sudden I'm walking in this curved hallway. And like the first thing I notice, it's like, I'm not tall. Like I'm 6 foot tall. And like, I'm not tall. I like noticed it right away. Like, what's going on? I'm short. And then I look and I look to my right. She says, what's around you? And I look to my right and I left and there's like these gray beings right and left of me. And then I look at my own body and I have these long fingers and I got this skinny body and this like tight little spacesuit on. And I'm like talking to the hypnotherapist. I'm like, I think I'm a gray alien. And she, without skipping a beat, she's like, just continue. What else happens next? Like this feels really normal. Like that was almost shocking. Like this is totally, completely normal. Like I'm a gray alien and it's normal. And and then she said, what happens next? And I'm like, suddenly it like jump cuts to me being in a conference room. And the conference room was really ugly and tacky. It was like beige with like folding chairs and folding tables, and like it looked like like the little conference room like in a cheap hotel in Muncie, Indiana, or something like that. It was, fluorescent lights and like in like a three-sided set, like on Saturday Night Live. It looked just like that. It looked like if someone built it, they would build a three-sided set, and it was. But there I was standing there as a gray alien, and I was standing looking at this desk like a trial or a grand jury meeting. And I'm like looking at these beings at a desk, and there's two beings behind me, and there's like all the beings are kind of grayed out, but my impression is that they're like gray aliens. They're like fuzzy. Like I don't have a good memory of the people there. I remember being confronted like in a tribunal, and I'm like, why am I here? Like what am I doing here? And they're like, you chose this. Like, what do you mean I chose this? How did I choose this? I didn't choose this. And they're like, you volunteered for this. Well, what does that mean? Now is the time. What are you talking about? You volunteered for this. What? And then all of a sudden what got into this, like you can hear all of a sudden I start crying in the session. And I get into this like William Shatner like speech, this dramatic speech, and I start yelling at these beings. I'm like, you never told me there would be pain here. You never told me there would be loneliness here. You never told me about sadness. You never told me that when I
Wow.
came here there would be loneliness and sadness,
Wow.
and you don't understand the stresses. Like you never told me. And they
Wow.
went, you volunteered for this, and now is the time. And I'm like, and she's asking me these questions like, what is happening? What does it mean? And like, they want me to play some role.
Huh.
And I'm swearing and I'm like, this is fucked up that you would put me through this. How you have no fucking idea how like, and I was just
Wow.
steaming mad at these beings.
Uh-huh.
And then it built and built and built and built. And it was like, and I was like, I think I'm back in the sleeping bag.
Mm-hmm.
But so the impression is which I don't know is true, is that so the story that emerged was that I volunteered to incarnate on this life. And in a previous life, I had been a gray alien on some other planet or some
Okay.
other realm. Now, is this the right brain talking to the left brain? Is this my old self talking to a new self? Is this me just creating a mystical narrative? Did I
Or a
generate or
way to,
confabulate to like, to,
or a
I mean,
way,
yeah, a way.
this is just a way for you to have a catharsis, for you to say, to like have that venting of emotion of like, of your frustration. Because I mean, because I have that, it's usually in my songs that I'll express it. Like, I don't want to be here. Why am I here? What's going on? I need answers, and I'm furious at you. When I was in that state of, I was very angry at God when I did the 12 steps. My resentment was against God. I was just like done with this whole thing, you know. But I have to see it through my lens. I want to stay friends with you, Mike. You've had this extraordinary experience. I want to tether where somehow we'll still, because I think you're a great guy, and I think this is fascinating, and like, I want to, you know what I'm saying? I don't
Oh,
want this to separate us. Have you lost any friends from your
I bet you I've
experience?
lost a few friends. I
You
think I've
probably
some friends.
gained more, right?
I've gained more friends, and the
Yeah.
friends I have are pretty interesting now. The
And
new friends I have,
for me,
yeah.
that's kind of a success in a weird way. Not to judge either one, but it's like, look, I mean, if you found a loving community, then God bless, and for people to connect and to come out of hiding and to stay and be connected for whatever, what harm is it bringing? I think a lot of people are just very afraid, and they want to make the scientific claims when this is really sort of the soul or the spirit speaking. It's mythological language, and sort of perceive life in a new way, which I think is important for us to do as we evolve, to stay open and so forth. But
So that hypnotherapist, before
yeah.
we started the session, I took her aside and said, at some point in this, when I'm vulnerable in this open, my subconscious mind is allowed to run free. You ask me about the owls, like ask me what's up with the owls.
Okay.
And so like after this, like I'm back in the sleeping bag and there's a sort of calm, and then she says, and Mike, what is your connection to the owls? And without skipping a beat, I sort of go, which is like I've spent the last 10 years, owls, owls, owls. It's all about owls, the mythology of owls. There's nothing like more on my radar than owls. I say without skipping a beat, which I never would have said. I said, the owls aren't important.
Huh.
And I've said this many times, so it's only a couple sentences, and it came out so clear.
Wow.
Like it was like I spoke it very clearly. And when you do hypnosis, you kind of like mumble and you kind of say, well, I'm kind of like, I'm in this hallway. So instead, I'm talking totally clear. The owls aren't important.
Huh.
The owl is a sign on a door. The owl is the correct symbol for the door, but it's the door that is important. We are on this side of the door, and on the other side of the door is an infinite vastness. And that came out of nowhere. Like I just like espoused that, and I sounded now. So that left me like it almost like freed me up. Like, okay, the owls aren't important. Great. Whew. Okay. Like I don't have to cling to the owls. And then I did I kind of like looked at my notes and my calendar and everything like that. So the owl book, the big fat first owl book that like I spent 5 years working on or whatever it was. Well, not 5 years, but it was, I had already collected a bunch of stories and things like that. But so I started that first owl book within 48 hours of that event on the side of the road in southern Utah.
Wow.
So that basically I had this experience. So if I take it literally, I camped on the side of the road. I got taken out of my body. I got put in a gray alien, like a little suit. I basically said, it's like a rubber suit. It's like a rubber suit. I'm in a rubber suit, but I'm a gray alien and my soul is in it. And then I have this experience like, what am I doing here? And like, you chose this. Now is the time. And I'm like, fuck you. You want me to play some role? And then I write a book about owls. in UFOs right in the aftermath of that. Like,
Wow.
like started it within 48 hours
Well,
of that.
I thought it was beautiful when that moment where you said it's the right symbol for the door that the door opens to. It just, and a lot of this is, it's, for the place that said that's beautiful is a place that is not about words and language. It was a matter of like that, you get the sense of liberation, that we have these signs and symbols and they help us get places, but at a certain point they're not important. The certain point is to get us there. They are important, but it's like they're really like places to place our feet or signposts or whatever. I mean, I think it was Wittgenstein who said, it's like, this is the scaffolding. Like I've done this to get to the scaffold. This is the scaffolding, but once you've built the building, you can jettison the scaffolding. So it's a way of, and I think it's all about, I don't know, whatever. I can riff on it as well. I mean, we're coming up to an hour and a half. Is there anything you'd like to say?
No, but I will say that what you're saying,
Yeah.
like you're tapping into this on this, you said it felt beautiful to hear this. There's almost nothing to that little thing. It's like, oh, there's the owl's a sign on the door and the door is important. And when I did have the hypnosis experience, like I had this vision, like I was in a hallway and it looked like a really cheap special effect from like a Doctor Who episode or something like that. I opened this door and there's like these swirling nebulas and it looked like crummy, low grade video CGI of like stars and swirling nebulas and stuff like that. And it was pretty corny, that the image that I had in my head. But the symbol is just a symbol, right? So it implies something. So the owl is a symbol, the coyote is a symbol, the UFO is a symbol. And it just implies something. But what that deeper thing is, we may not be able to articulate pragmatically like a scientist could. But we like the story I told of the little boy in the kite string, like that story you could dismiss, but for me, like in my heart, like I really feel something from that story. So that's where I'm drawn to in this stuff, that I'm drawn to the deeply emotional, not even mystical, but just the deeply emotional aspects of these,
Right.
of these symbolic events.
And I think the thing is, what was beautiful about it is that I know how the owl has been like dominant in your experience and so forth, and to see that you sort of graduate from it in a certain way, like honoring that, but still saying there's a deeper liberation that I've come to. That for me was beautiful, and that we can honor the symbols, but the real source of our spiritual liberation is something that ineffable and unspeakable. And I think for me it's fear and love. It's the same thing that Bill Hicks talks about. It's either fear or love. When we're faced with a void, I'm either going to be in a state of fear and wanting to control, or I'm going to surrender and fill that space with love. But
Oh, and just a heads up, Bill Hicks had an owl and UFO story.
wow, do you have what is it?
He took a heavy dose of mushrooms and had this psychedelic experience of being on board a flying saucer with his friend, and they both talked telepathically to each other while Kevin Booth was his friend. And then so he had a totally trippy UFO experience on mushrooms, and then he eventually died of cancer. I can't remember what kind of cancer it was.
Was it pancreatic?
I think so, yeah. And so in the lead up to his death, his friend Kevin Booth was seeing owls all the time, and he felt that they were connected. And so so and Kevin Booth has this sort of sad story where Bill was very weak with cancer and said, "Oh my gosh, this is so funny. I was on my way to call you, and just on the way, I saw this owl, and like we locked eyes, and it was on the path, and it was just as I was coming in to call you." And Bill Hicks was just like silent because he knew the lore. The owl is also
Huh.
in most cultures associated with death.
Okay.
So, which is another transformative realm, like being, death is a is an alternate reality, just like being on board a UFO is an alternate reality. So
I
so
think.
Bill Hicks was the source of a bunch of owl synchronicities,
Hmm.
and then he had a powerful UFO event. When I wrote a whole chapter about it in that first book, the Blue Book. So
Messengers. Okay.
yeah,
So I think that's good to end on. I love Bill.
so do
And
I.
so if you want to put in the chat, I just want to get approval that it's cool to post this
It's
from
totally
both of
cool to
us.
post this. Yeah.
And then I can put in the YouTube space any links to further
So if anyone wants,
information about you, or if you want
yeah,
to speak that.
yeah. So I've done this. So if you can Google MikeClelland.com. And if you want to look up, you got this New York City sound effect record in
You
the
got to put
background. Yeah.
you got to put owls though. There's some politician who's got your name.
Oh, he is. But he doesn't have MikeClelland.com. I have that.
Oh,
So,
MikeClelland.com. Okay,
yeah.
yeah.
So he's a fireman out of Florida.
Okay.
And then, but you can also just Google UFOs, owls, and I am the first thing that comes up. You'll find me. And my books are available on Amazon. And
Messengers, and then there's a
Stories from the Messengers, and then Hidden Experience. And Hidden Experience, the third book, is a sort of memoir through my blog posts. So when I said that chapter of my life when I was like, is this really happening? Is this really happening? I was like blogging furiously during that chapter of my life. And there's some wild, weird stories in that chapter of my life. And I tell the hypnosis session, I did a transcript of that hypnosis session, and that's in the culmination of that third book, Hidden Experience.
Okay. All right. I think we can end it there. You agree?
Oh, I'm off. Yeah, this was a joy.
All right. That was awesome. I appreciate it so much. And I wish you all the best.
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't seen you in ages. We haven't talked in, I don't know how long.
I know, but we'll do it again.
Great.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay. You're
Have
very
a
welcome.
great day.
You too.
Bye.